Hey, it's Art from My New Microphone. Welcome back to the channel. Sampled drums are commonplace in many genres today, including hip-hop, rap, and many electronic genres, and it's sometimes the case that we will rely entirely on drum samples to create our pseudo drum kits within the mix. And while it can be incredibly useful to be able to pick the exact sounds that we want for each drum in our sessions, it can also be challenging to make these drum sounds sound realistic in the mix. And so relying entirely on samples can be very difficult to make them sound like real acoustic drum kits, but there are plenty of strategies that we can employ to make our sampled drums sound more realistic. So in this video, we are going to take a look at a few of these strategies and turn something that sounds like this into something that sounds a little bit more realistic like this. So without further ado, let's hop into the digital audio workstation and get started. All right, let's start off with the obvious here and state that if you want more natural sounding sampled drums, choose more realistic sounding samples from the get-go. And so I have a bunch of different options here. We'll have a look at kick, snare, clap, hats, toms, and loops. And you can tell me which ones sound more natural, more realistic than the others. So here are the kicks, snares, claps, hats, toms, loops. And so the first options in each of these drum types sound more natural than the latter options in each of these drum types. So again, if you want more natural sounding sampled drums, choose more natural sounding samples. Now, after that, what I really like to do to start things off is to program my samples to a scratch take. So a scratch take can be any human performance. That can be tapping next to the microphone. It can be playing actual drums. It can be beatboxing, anything to get a sense of a rhythm and a beat that you can then program your drums to. So in this instance, I have this scratch take, which is just me tapping on my desk next to a microphone. And then I literally went in and inserted samples at each of these different hits here that you can see in the audio file of that scratch take. You can see that they are far from the grid in some instances. I'm not a great drummer by any stretch of the imagination, but this is just for example's sake. So you heard the scratch take, and here are the drums to go along with it. And so you hear there that it's not anywhere near perfect. And from here, I actually improved the idea and made things much more quantized, so to speak. It sounds like this. All right, so this is going to act as our starting point, and we are going to improve upon this basic beat and make these sampled drums sound more realistic. You hear that each individual sample sounds relatively realistic on its own. However, we are getting exact copies of these drums every time they are played back, and so they sound very robotic. And even though they do sound natural, they don't sound realistic as if a real drummer is playing them. While we're here, I should note that I sort of quantized these to the grid. We could also work with a sampler, for example. If I opened up this sampler, I could perform this with MIDI. And then with the MIDI information, I would actually stretch out the notes so that the entirety of these samples were actually being played back. And then I could quantize the MIDI information from there and deal with velocities and different things like that. If you do want to learn more about using samplers to make your sampled instruments that much more realistic, I do have a video going into programming drums and making your programmed drums sound more realistic. I'll leave a card to that up top and also a link to that in the video description down below. I would highly encourage you to check that one out after you're done watching this video. So we have our starting point right here, and we are going to basically build upon this and try to make these drums sound as realistic as possible. So we have an open hat, a closed hat, a snare, and a kick. I'm giving myself quite a challenge for this video. We're going to try to make these sound realistic. So the first thing we can add are ghost notes. So you see here that I have quite a few things added. First and foremost, I have this additional kick drum happening right here on a 32nd note going into the second and into the fourth bar of the beat. I also have these additional snares. If I click on any of these, you see that the gain is way down. So even though these faders are relatively high, these snare brushes, which are just copies of this main snare, are actually going to be quite a bit quieter in the mix. And then I also have this one shot that I added to it. So now we have an open hat, a closed hat, a rim shot, a snare, and a kick. And then right here in the hats, I actually split these hats up. And so every hat that is on an odd 16th note has been dropped down to this track right here, audio 22, and has consequently been lowered in volume. So this is what we have with some ghost notes. Compare that to the original. So just a little bit of extra movement, making it sound that much closer to a real drummer. From there, I like to utilize time compression and expansion. It's one of my favorite tools to use when dealing with samples that are repeating, because by expanding a sample like this or compressing it like this along the timeline will actually change its audio information. It'll change the actual waveform. And so we'll still get the same essence of the sample. For example, a kick will still sound like a kick, unless of course we stretch it way too far or compress it way too far. But because we're altering the sound wave, we actually get a different sound. And so if I was, for example, to copy this kick drum, move it down here, and then compress, we could then have a look at the differences in the waveform. You can see that it is largely the same throughout the initial transient. However, in the tail, there are some differences right here. And so we can use time compression expansion not to alter the overall tone of an instrument, not to go too far with it, but we can certainly alter the sound and make it sound as if the same drum is being hit just a little bit differently, as is the case when real drums are being played. And so if we have a closer look over here, you can see that I've gone through and time compressed and expanded a whole bunch of different tracks. For example, in the snare, these were all the same exact sample, and you can see that this one's been stretched out, this one's been left alone, this one's been stretched out, this one's been compressed quite a bit. And I literally just go through and make little adjustments like this and like this, just to change things up. And so with a little bit of time compression and expansion, we have this. Compare that with the original once again. And there's just a little bit more movement here, a little bit more sonic variety between the hits. From there, I want to dequantize or drag or rush certain parts of the beat, make things a little bit less on the grid, a little bit less perfect or robotic. And so if we have a look at this new iteration of the sampled beat, we have these offbeat hats being pushed a little bit further back, a little late in the timeline. We have the kick over here being pushed a little bit late. And these are just things to nudge the drum hits a little bit off the grid and add a little bit of rhythm, a little bit of groove, while still maintaining the overall integrity of the beat and of the rhythm. So this is what this would sound like. It's very subtle, but it can make a huge difference in getting a more realistic sounding sampled drum sound. And we can again compare that to the original. Next up, we have creative chopping. Now, this is a strategy I really like employing when I'm dealing with loops or longer drum samples. And so what I did here for the example in this video is I actually bounced out these hats right here. And I just went through and chopped them up and reordered them and just added more hits where there weren't hits before. So just a little bit of creative chopping can go a long way to make things sound a little bit more realistic. I personally really like using this when I have sampled brush strokes on a snare drum, just as a way to mix things up and not have the same loop playing over and over again. So here's what this sounds like. And I still find that the hat is sounding a little bit too same-ish, even if I'm chopping things up and applying different ghost notes and different volumes. So oftentimes I will apply more drastic volume changes. And you can see here that I've focused my efforts again on the hat. And I have a whole bunch of different chops right here. And if we look on this left panel inside Logic Pro, we can have a look at the differences in gain. And so this first block right here has no gain change. This one's negative 7.5 dB. This one's negative 4.5. This one's 0, negative 2.8, and so on and so forth. So I'm changing the volume of each individual hit, or sometimes a block will have 2 or 3 hits. And this just helps to approximate the actual hitting of, in this case, a hi-hat, where the drummer will not be hitting it with the same velocity, the same force every time. So it's just another way to get a little bit more sonic variation and a little bit more realism out of the drums. We can compare that again with the original. Another thing I really like doing with sampled drums, especially when I have them laid out like this, is to add a little bit of noise to layer over top the drums. And so in this case, I have a little bit of vinyl crackle every time the kick happens. Here's what this sounds like by itself. It's very low in the mix. And then in addition to that, I have some dry leaves Foley down here that happens every time the snare hits. Just to dirty up the overall sound of the sampled drums, just add a little bit of noise that would naturally happen in real acoustic recorded drums. This is very subtle, but it can go a long way to get a more natural sounding sampled drum sound. So it's barely noticeable, but it is there, and it does add a little bit more grit, a little bit more extra information to the overall drum sound. So we're not quite there yet. It still sounds very sampled, very robotic, but we are making our way there. So next up, I have the introduction of effects, notably transient shaper automation. You can see that I have some automation happening in the transient shaper, the Kilohertz transient shaper. It's a great free plugin. I'll leave a link to this and all other plugins we'll be using in the description box down below. You can see the automation happening here. And basically what I'm doing is just altering the amount of attack that's happening, particularly on these hats. I should mention that when we are dealing with drums, it's super important to have a particular focus on the hi-hats and the snare drums. These are typically the most expressive instruments as part of a drum kit. So it's important to get a lot of expression out of those, especially when utilizing the same sample over and over again, as we are in this case. So let's have a look and listen to what's happening here with this transient shaper. Then in addition to the transient shaper automation, I also have LFO tool, which acts sort of like a tremolo or an amplitude modulator, although at a LFO rate. And you can see here that every quarter note that happens, we start at full volume, and then halfway through we're ducking down, and then we're coming right back up. So you can see this in action as I play this back, and this is altering the volume of the hi-hats in this case. So you can hear those hi-hats starting to come to life a little bit, start to sound a little bit more realistic. Let's go back to the very starting idea. And now with this extra modulation. Next up, I like to set up a sort of pseudo drum room channel. Typically, when we are recording acoustic drums, we will set up one or a few drum room mics that are distanced away from the drum kit and help to pick up a holistic sound of the kit and also the overall sound of the room that the drums are playing in. And so a pseudo drum room, I usually set this up, if we open the mixer, with an auxiliary track, and I will send all of the drums to this track. In this case, we are sending to bus 1. Bus 1 is coming over here. I just have the stock Space Designer convolution reverb here in Logic, and I chose the drum chamber. And then additionally, I did a little bit of EQ to roll off some of the top end, some of the low end, and then I compressed it, which is a common practice on drum room mics, just to help bring them out a little bit. So by itself, the pseudo drum room sounds like this. So it doesn't sound like a real room, but it does help to add a little bit of space and dimension to these otherwise very dry sounding samples. So together, the room and the samples sound like. Without the room. With. Again, we can compare that to the original. Sounds like these samples could actually be part of a real kit in a real acoustic space. We're not quite there yet, but this is a step in the right direction. After that, I really like sending the snare to a snare plate. This is another common practice when recording drums and mixing drums, to send the snare to a plate reverb, just as a way to help add more dimension, particularly to the snare, but also to the overall sound of the kit. And you see here that in these two snare drums, I have them sent to bus 3, and I can also send this additional one as well. And bus 3 is over here. I have the Sound Toys little plate. It's a great EMT 140 emulation. I have it mixed pretty low, but this helps to add more dimensionality to the overall drums and especially the snare. This is what this sounds like. Without and with. Might even be a bit too much. We can bring that down a little bit in terms of the decay. So we're starting to sound a little bit more realistic, and I think that we've come quite a long way from the original pattern that we had there. The next step I really like using is bus processing. Once again, when we are mixing actual acoustic drums, we will often send them to a drum group and then process them with a little bit of glue processing, so to speak, which can help make a more cohesive sounding kit. And the same thing can be applied especially to drum samples that aren't by themselves cohesive. So we now have these being sent to the drum bus, and you see here that I've automated the solid state logic SSL comp from Waves, as well as the Saturn II from FabFilter. I've automated those things on in this section right here. So we can have a listen to what the drums now sound like when they are being routed through the drum bus and then through this compressor, and some saturation here. Without. With. Processing just helps glue them together, make them sound more cohesive, make them sound like they are part of a holistic kit and all work together. I find that this type of processing to be essential if we are wanting to get our different samples to work better together in the mix. And from there, I put further processing on the snare and the hats. So we can see that a few things are going to turn on here in the mixer. If I go over here, we see that 2 Saturns turn on, one for each of the hat tracks. So we have Saturn II, once again, warm tape. We are driving it quite a bit, and I believe I drove the open hi-hat a little bit more. And then I have the decapitator on the snare. And actually, in the case of this snare sample, when I added the Sound Toys decapitator and then drove it with a bit of drive and then mixed it in parallel with the original signal, I actually got a sort of pseudo bottom mic for the snare that sort of gave me a sound as if it was capturing the snare wires on the underneath. Of course, this is all virtual. We're dealing with samples, but it kind of gave me that sound. So here is just the snare without and with. And then I added another transient shaper here just to take down some of that sustain, make it a little bit poppier. And the whole thing together. So once again, these are samples, and I'm only using a very select few samples. I have 1 kick, 1 snare, I guess 1 rim shot, 2 hats, 1 open, 1 closed, and then I have a little bit of noise. And so there's actually quite a bit we can do with a very limited pool of options. And that's really what I wanted to show in this video, is how to take a very select few drum samples and actually make them sound like a cohesive kit. So if we were to quickly go back to what we started with, just for a quick A/B comparison, here is the original. And what we ended up with. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'd love to open up a dialogue on making sampled drums like this sound more realistic. Be sure to hit that like button if you did enjoy this video, and also subscribe here to the Mighty Microphone YouTube channel if you'd like more information and tips on music production. And I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.